The TSA officer did not just ask for my passport. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and steel before his hand dropped to his holster, and he said 3 words that ended my life as a free man: "Step aside, sir." I was standing there in my socks, holding my leather belt, and a boarding pass for a flight that was supposed to take me to a new beginning. But instead, I was staring down the barrel of a betrayal so deep it stopped my heart before the taser even could. My name is Thomas Harrison, and 5 minutes ago I was a respected structural engineer on his way to a probate hearing to finalize a $5 million trust. But now I am a suspect in a domestic terrorism plot orchestrated by the one person I spent 40 years protecting. If you are watching this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you have ever been stabbed in the back by the hand you used to hold. The metal detector had not even beeped, but the alarm that went off was in the eyes of the 3 agents swarming toward me. I have built bridges that span raging rivers, and I know the sound of tension before a cable snaps, and the air around me was vibrating with it. "Sir, get on the ground now. Do not move, do not speak. Just get on the ground." I tried to speak. I tried to tell them I was 70 years old and had 2 artificial knees, but the first agent did not wait for an explanation. He kicked my legs out from under me. My face hit the cold, hard linoleum of O'Hare Airport with a sickening thud that rattled my teeth and sent a shockwave of pain through my arthritic shoulder. The breath left my lungs in a wheeze. I could hear the gasp of the crowd around us, the whispers of strangers judging me, assuming I was a criminal, assuming I deserved this. A heavy boot pressed into the small of my back, pinning me down like a rabid animal, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly helpless. I turned my head to the side, my cheek pressed against the dirty floor, and my eyes locked onto the digital clock on the wall above the security scanners. It read 7:45 in the morning. My flight to New York was scheduled to board in exactly 20 minutes and take off at 8:30. The probate hearing that would decide the fate of my entire estate began at 10 o'clock sharp. I had spent my career calculating load-bearing limits and safety margins, and I knew with mathematical certainty that I was watching my timeline collapse. If I was not in that courtroom at 10 o'clock, the judge would declare me absent, and by default, the control of my assets would pass to the next of kin. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted, though I was not moving a muscle. I was too stunned to move. I felt hands patting me down, searching me, violating the dignity I had spent 7 decades building. They yanked my carry-on bag, the vintage leather duffel that my late wife had given me for our 25th anniversary, and dumped its contents right there on the security conveyor belt. My clothes, my books, my toiletries spilled out for the world to see, but that was not what they were looking for. I watched from the floor as the lead agent, wearing blue latex gloves, reached into the side pocket of my bag, a pocket I had not opened in years. He pulled out a clear plastic Ziploc bag filled with a fine white powder. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at it in confusion, because I knew what that was, or at least what it looked like. It looked like the powdered sugar my daughter-in-law Tiffany used for her famous red velvet cookies. She had been so sweet last night, insisting on packing my bag for me, telling me I needed to rest, telling me she wanted to make sure I had everything I needed for the trip. Baking ingredients. I rasped out, my voice weak from the pressure on my chest. "It is just sugar." The agent did not answer. He just bagged it as evidence, and then he reached back into the duffel. This time his hand wrapped around something cold and black. He pulled out a handgun. The crowd screamed. People were ducking behind benches, covering their children's eyes. I stared at the weapon in horror. It was a Glock 9mm, or at least it looked exactly like one, but as the light from the ceiling hit the barrel, I saw a faint scratch, revealing gray plastic underneath the matte black paint. It was a toy. It was my grandson's toy gun, the one I had bought him for Halloween, painted to look lethal. "This is a Class 1 felony," the agent hissed, leaning down so close I could smell the coffee on his breath. "Attempting to board an aircraft with a firearm and a suspicious substance." "I am not a criminal," I pleaded, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. "That is a toy. My grandson plays with it. Someone put it there." I have never owned a gun in my life. I am an engineer, for God's sake. I build things, I do not destroy them. The pressure on my back eased slightly as they hauled me to my feet, not to let me go, but to cuff my hands behind my back. The metal bit into my wrists, tight and unforgiving. They marched me through the terminal, past the horrified faces of families going on vacation, past the businessmen checking their watches. I walked with my head down, not because I was guilty, but because I was trying to hide the tears of rage that were threatening to spill over. They shoved me into a small, windowless interrogation room, the air stagnant and smelling of stale sweat. They sat me down on a metal chair that was bolted to the floor. A man in a suit walked in, not a TSA agent, but a detective, his badge clipped to his belt, his face hard and unreadable. He threw a file onto the metal table between us. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We take these threats very seriously." "What threats?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It is sugar and a toy gun. You can test the powder right now, taste it. Put it in a lab, I do not care. It is sugar. And that gun is plastic. Who is doing this to me?" The detective leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "It is not just the items in your bag, Mr. Harrison. We received a call. A very specific call warning us that a passenger matching your description was boarding Flight 304 with the intention of bringing the plane down. The caller stated you have been suffering from severe mental decline and have expressed suicidal ideations involving mass casualties." The room spun. Mental decline. Suicidal. These were the exact words I had heard whispered in my kitchen 2 nights ago when I got up for a glass of water. Words I thought I had imagined in my half-sleep. Who I whispered the word barely escaping my lips. "Who called you?" The detective looked at his notes, and for a second, just a split second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He looked at me the way a man looks at a dog that has been kicked one too many times. "The report was filed by a family member, sir," he said quietly. "Your son, Brandon Harrison." The name hit me harder than the floor had. Brandon. My boy. The boy I had carried on my shoulders at the zoo. The boy whose college tuition I had paid by working double shifts at the firm. The boy who just this morning had hugged me at the door and told me to have a safe flight. He had not just called to stop me. He had called to brand me a terrorist. He had called to make sure that even if I missed the flight, I would never walk free again. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:15. My flight was boarding. The doors to the jet bridge were closing. And miles away in a courtroom in New York, a judge was preparing to call my name. I was going to miss the hearing. I was going to lose the trust. But as I sat there handcuffed to a table in a cold interrogation room, a fire began to kindle in my chest. It was not the fire of anger. It was the cold blue flame of a structural engineer realizing that the foundation of his house was rotten, and that the only way to save the land was to burn the structure down to the ground. I looked up at the detective, and my voice did not tremble this time. "Check the caller ID," I said, "and then test that powder. Because when you realize that is sugar and that is a toy, you are going to want to hear what I have to say about my son." The detective paused, his hand hovering over the file. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. And in that silence, the war began. The metal table was cold against my forearms, and the handcuffs bit into my wrists every time I shifted in the hard steel chair. The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and fear, a scent I recognized from years of working on high-pressure construction sites. But this time, the fear was mine. Detective Miller sat across from me, leaning back in his chair, with a look of exhausted patience that was far more insulting than anger would have been. To him, I was not Thomas Harrison, the man who had designed the suspension systems for 3 major bridges in this state. I was just another confused geriatric case, a senile old man who had lost his way and caused a scene at the airport. He did not see the calculation in my eyes, he only saw the wrinkles on my face. He reached into the evidence box and tossed the plastic bag of white powder onto the table between us. It landed with a soft thud that echoed loudly in the small soundproof room. Miller looked at the bag, then at me, shaking his head slowly. He asked me if I knew how many years a man of my age could get for trafficking a controlled substance across state lines. He spoke to me slowly, articulating every syllable as if I were a child or someone with a hearing impairment, asking if I understood the gravity of the situation. I looked at the bag, and suddenly the cold gray walls of the police station dissolved. My mind was pulled back to just 12 hours ago. I was standing in the warm golden light of my son Brandon's kitchen. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla because my daughter-in-law Tiffany had been baking. She was humming a soft tune, moving around the island with that efficient grace I had always admired, or perhaps the grace I had mistaken for kindness. I was sitting at the counter feeling the ache in my joints from the damp weather, worrying about the flight and the court hearing the next morning. Tiffany had walked over to me, her smile bright and reassuring, and placed a mug of warm milk in front of me. She told me to drink it, saying it would help me sleep before the big day. I remembered the way she had placed her hand on my shoulder, a gentle squeeze that felt like affection. She told me not to worry about packing. She said, "Dad, you have done enough for everyone else your whole life. Let me take care of you tonight. Go upstairs and rest. I will pack your carry-on bag myself." I had felt a surge of gratitude then. I thought I was blessed to have family who cared for me in my old age. I went to bed thinking about how lucky I was, unaware that downstairs in that cinnamon-scented kitchen, she was not just packing my clothes. She was packing my destruction. She was carefully spooning that white powder into a bag, burying it deep inside my toiletries, knowing exactly what it would look like on an X-ray scanner. She was not packing for a trip. She was packing for an ambush. The memory burned in my chest, hot and painful, snapping me back to the cold reality of the interrogation room. I looked at Miller, and the shame I had felt earlier was replaced by a cold, hard rage. I sat up straighter, the chains of the handcuffs clinking against the table. I looked Miller dead in the eye and told him to stop treating me like a criminal and start acting like a detective. I nodded at the bag on the table and told him to open it. Miller frowned, looking confused by my change in tone. I leaned forward as much as the restraints would allow and challenged him. I asked him if he really thought a 70-year-old retired engineer with a pension and a pristine record would suddenly decide to start moving drugs through O'Hare Airport. I told him to use his head. I told him to open the bag and taste it. Miller hesitated. He looked at the bag, then back at me. I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. I pressed him harder. I told him it was not cocaine. I told him it was not anthrax. I told him it was powdered sugar. High-quality confectioner's sugar used for red velvet cake. The same cake my daughter-in-law was baking while she called the police to report me. The detective stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching thin. Then slowly, he reached out and picked up the bag. He opened the seal. He dipped his pinky finger into the fine white dust and touched it to his tongue. His eyes widened slightly. The sweetness hit him, and I saw his shoulders drop. It was sugar. Just as I said. For a second, I felt a spark of hope. I thought this was it. I thought he would unlock the cuffs, apologize for the mistake, and drive me to the airport himself. I thought logic had won. But Miller did not reach for his keys. He did not smile. Instead, his expression shifted from suspicion to something worse. Pity. Deep, condescending pity. He wiped his hand on a napkin and pushed the bag of sugar aside. He sighed a long, heavy exhale and reached for a folder that was sitting on the edge of the desk. He told me that the sugar was good news because it meant I was not going to federal prison for drug trafficking. But then he opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a fax, the ink still fresh and slightly smeared. He slid it across the table toward me. He told me that while the drugs might be fake, the concern for my well-being was very real. He tapped his finger on the document. I looked down at the paper, and the words swam before my eyes. It was a medical report. My name was at the top, followed by a date of birth that was correct and a social security number that was mine. But below that, under the diagnosis section, were words that made my blood run cold. Dementia, paranoid delusions, stage 3 cognitive decline. Patient exhibits aggressive behavior and confusion regarding reality. Miller spoke softly, now his voice dripping with that terrible gentleness. He told me that my son Brandon had faxed this over 10 minutes ago. He said my son was very worried about me. He claimed that in my confusion, I often packed strange items believing them to be valuable or dangerous. He said the toy gun and the sugar were just symptoms of my illness, proof that I was no longer capable of taking care of myself. I stared at the paper. It was a forgery. Or worse, it was a document from a doctor they had paid off, or perhaps a manipulation of a visit I had made for simple insomnia. They had not just tried to frame me as a criminal. That would have been too easy to disprove. They had done something far more sinister. They had framed me as a madman. A criminal has rights. A criminal gets a lawyer. But a man with advanced dementia, he gets a guardian. He gets his rights stripped away for his own protection. Miller looked at me, convinced he was doing the right thing. He told me that based on this medical history and the incident today, he could not let me leave. He could not put me on a plane. He said he had to hold me here until my legal guardian arrived to take custody of me. He said my son was on his way. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had been welded tight. I was not going to jail. I was going to be handed over to the very people who had set me up, and the law was going to help them do it. I looked at the clock. It was 8:45. My plane had left. The hearing was in an hour. And I was sitting there, a sane man, holding a piece of paper that said I had lost my mind. But as I looked at Miller's pitying face, I remembered something. I remembered the phone in my pocket, the burner phone I kept for emergencies, the one they had not found because they were too busy looking for weapons. And I remembered the camera I had installed in Brandon's living room 3 weeks ago, not out of paranoia, but out of a gut feeling that something was wrong. They thought I was senile. They thought I was helpless. They were about to find out that my memory was just fine. Miller stared at the sugar on his fingertip for a moment longer than necessary, then wiped it away with a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach turn. He did not unlock the cuffs. He did not apologize. Instead, he reached into the leather folder sitting on the edge of the metal table and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The sound of the paper sliding across the steel surface was the only noise in the room, and it sounded like a cell door slamming shut. "This is a fax we received 10 minutes ago, Mr. Harrison," he said, and his voice had lost the aggressive edge of an interrogator, only to be replaced by the patronizing tone of a nurse speaking to a difficult patient. "It was sent by your son, Brandon." I looked down at the document. It was a medical report on the letterhead of a clinic I had visited once for insomnia. But the diagnosis at the bottom was not insomnia. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. Paranoid schizophrenia. Stage 3 dementia with aggressive tendencies. Patient is prone to fabricating elaborate conspiracy theories and poses a danger to himself and others. "It is a lie," I said, and my voice was dangerously calm. I knew exactly what this was. This was not just about making me miss a flight. This was a legal execution. In the state of Illinois, if a person is deemed mentally incompetent, they lose the right to hire a lawyer. They lose control of their bank accounts. They become a ward of the state until a guardian is appointed. And the petitioner for that guardianship is always the next of kin. "Brandon wrote this," I said, looking up at Miller. "Or he paid a doctor to write it. I manage my own investments. I designed the suspension system for the bridge you drove over to get to work this morning. Does this look like the resume of a madman to you?" Miller looked at me with pity. "That is exactly what the report says you would say," he replied, tapping the paper. It says you often fixate on your past career to mask your cognitive decline. Mr. Harrison, I cannot release you. Not with a weapon however fake and a substance however harmless found in your possession, combined with this medical history. Then let me call my lawyer, I demanded, struggling against the restraints. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She has my real medical records. She can prove this is a fabrication. I cannot do that, Miller said, shaking his head. If you are in a state of mental crisis, as this report suggests, you do not have the legal capacity to instruct counsel. I have to follow protocol. We have contacted the emergency contact listed on the fax. The blood drained from my face. I knew who was coming. I knew the performance that was about to happen. No, I whispered. Do not let them in. The heavy steel door buzzed and clicked open. The air in the room shifted instantly. Brandon walked in first, looking disheveled in a way that seemed carefully calculated. His eyes were red-rimmed as if he had been crying. Tiffany followed him, clutching a tissue to her nose, her face a mask of distraught concern. "Oh, Dad." Brandon choked out, rushing toward the table, but stopping just short of touching me as if he were afraid I might bite. "Thank God you are safe. We were so worried when we found the gun missing from the toy chest." "He is having an episode." "Isn't he?" Tiffany asked, turning to Detective Miller with wide, pleading eyes. "He gets like this when he forgets his medication. He thinks everyone is trying to steal his money. It is heartbreaking, Detective. We just want to get him help." I sat there frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer audacity of their performance. They were not just lying, they were erasing me. They were rewriting my reality in front of a law enforcement officer who was buying every word of it. I looked at Brandon, my son, and saw the Rolex on his wrist glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You are not taking me home," I said, my voice low and steady. "You are taking me to a facility so you can liquidate my estate." "See," Tiffany sobbed, burying her face in Brandon's shoulder. "The paranoia. It is getting worse." Miller stood up and nodded sympathetically at them. "I am releasing him into your custody," he said, reaching for the keys to the handcuffs. "But he needs immediate psychiatric evaluation." The key turned in the lock. The metal clicked open. But as the cuffs fell away, I did not feel free. I felt the weight of a trap snapping shut around my neck. Brandon reached out to take my arm, his grip tight and possessive. "Let's go home, Dad," he said, but his eyes were cold and dead. I stood up, rubbing my wrists. I looked at Miller, then at my son. I let them lead me toward the door because I knew fighting physically would only prove their point. But as we walked into the hallway, I reached into my pocket, and my fingers brushed against the cold plastic of the burner phone they had missed. They thought they had won. They thought the old engineer was broken. But they forgot one thing. A broken structure can still collapse on top of the people trying to demolish it. Brandon collided with me in a rush of fabric and expensive cologne, wrapping his arms around my shoulders in a display of affection that felt more like a tackle than a hug. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, and I could feel his chest heaving with sobbing breaths that were too rhythmic to be real. "Oh, Dad," he wailed, his voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable, just loud enough for Detective Miller to hear from the corner of the room. "I am so sorry we took so long. The traffic was a nightmare, and we were terrified the police would hurt you." I sat there rigid as a stone pillar while my son performed his scene. His grip on me was tight, suffocatingly so, but it was not the desperate clutch of a worried child. It was the restraining hold of a jailer, ensuring his prisoner did not bolt. I could smell the distinct scent of his sandalwood aftershave, the same expensive brand he had asked me to stop buying for myself because it was a waste of money. Yet here he was wearing enough of it to choke a horse. I tried to pull away, but Brandon tightened his hold, stroking the back of my head with a trembling hand. "It is okay, Dad," he whispered, but his lips were pressed right against my ear, and the whisper had a hard metallic edge to it. Just play along, old man, or you will spend the night in a federal holding cell. I looked over Brandon's shoulder and saw Tiffany standing by the detective's desk. She was not crying anymore. She had composed herself into the picture of the long-suffering daughter-in-law. She was leaning in close to Miller, speaking in a hushed, conspiratorial tone that women use when they are sharing a tragic secret. "I am so incredibly sorry for all of this. Officer," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "We have been trying to get him into a specialized facility for months, but he is so stubborn. He thinks he is still working on those skyscrapers he built 30 years ago. He packs his bag and says he has to go to a site inspection in New York. We usually catch him at the door, but today he slipped out while I was in the shower." She paused to wipe a non-existent tear from her cheek. "And the gun," she continued, shaking her head. "That is my son's toy. Dad must have taken it thinking he needed protection. The paranoia comes and goes in waves, but when it hits, it is terrifying. He thinks everyone is out to steal his fortune." Miller was nodding along, his face softening with every lie she spun. He looked at Tiffany and saw a saint. He looked at me and saw a broken, confused burden. The narrative was being constructed, brick by brick, around me, and I was trapped inside the walls. I shifted my weight, trying to shove Brandon off me, and that is when I saw it. As his sleeve rode up his wrist, the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room caught the glint of gold and ceramic. It was a watch. A Rolex Submariner with a blue dial. I stared at it, and the air left my lungs. 3 weeks ago, I had received an alert from my credit card company about a suspicious charge of $15,000. When I asked Brandon about it, he had sworn up and down that it was a mistake, a hacking attempt that he was handling with the bank. He told me he had canceled the card and the investigation was ongoing. He told me not to worry my pretty little head about finances. Yet there it was, $15,000 of my hard-earned savings sitting on the wrist of the man who was currently sobbing fake tears into my shirt. He had not just stolen my money, he was wearing the evidence of his theft while he framed me for losing my mind. The rage that surged through me was cold and sharp. I wanted to grab his wrist and shove it in Miller's face. I wanted to scream that a man with dementia does not track credit card statements. But I knew that any outburst, now any sign of aggression, would only prove their point. The medical report said I was violent. If I shouted, I was violent. If I fought, I was violent. My only defense was silence. Brandon finally pulled back, sniffing loudly. He kept one hand firmly on my shoulder, pinning me to the chair. He turned to Miller, his eyes red and watery. "Please, detective," he begged. "Do not press charges. He does not know what he is doing. If you put him in the system, it will kill him. He is frail. Look at him. He is just a confused old man who misses his wife and wants to feel useful again. We will take him straight to the Serenity Hills Care Facility. They have a bed waiting for him. We made the arrangements this morning when we realized he was missing." Serenity Hills. The name sent a chill down my spine. It was a state-run facility on the outskirts of the city known for over-sedating its patients and stripping them of their outside contact. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. If I went in there, I would never come out, and certainly not in time for the hearing. Miller looked at me, then back at Brandon. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The tension in the room hung heavy. I could see the wheels turning in the detective's head. He had a choice. He could process me, which meant paperwork, lawyers, and a judge who might throw the case out due to my age. Or he could hand me over to this nice, well-dressed couple who clearly loved me and wanted to get me help. It was the path of least resistance. "Okay," Miller said, and the words sounded like a gavel banging down. "Given the medical history and the nature of the items found, I am willing to release him into your custody without charges pending a psychiatric evaluation. But you have to promise me he goes straight to a doctor. If he shows up at this airport again, I will not be so lenient." "Thank you." Brandon exhaled, slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. Thank you so much, officer. You have no idea what this means to us. Tiffany rushed over, grabbing Miller's hand and shaking it vigorously. You are saving his life, she gushed. God bless you. Miller walked around the table and pulled out his keys. He reached for my wrist. I looked at him one last time, trying to communicate with my eyes, trying to beam the truth into his brain. Look at the watch, I screamed inside my head. Look at the lies. But Miller just unlocked the cuff. The steel clicked open. My hand was free. But before I could even rub the red mark on my skin, Brandon's hand clamped down on my forearm. I have got him, Brandon said quickly, pulling me up from the chair. Come on, Dad. Let's go home. The transition of custody was physical and terrifying. I went from being a suspect of the state to a prisoner of my son. His fingers dug into my bicep, pressing into the nerve. It was painful, a warning masquerading as support. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy. I looked at the burner phone in my pocket. They still did not know I had it. They thought they had won. They thought they were walking a senile old man to his doom. We walked out of the interrogation room and into the busy terminal. The noise of the airport hit me like a physical wave. Announcements over the intercom, people laughing, wheels of suitcases rolling over the tile. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of people going places. But I was going nowhere. Brandon leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear again. His voice dropped this act entirely. The weeping son was gone, replaced by the greedy predator. One word, he hissed. One word to anyone, and I tell the doctors you tried to grab the detective's gun. You will be sedated so heavily you will not remember your own name, let alone the combination to your safe. I walked in silence, the Rolex on his wrist flashing in my peripheral vision with every step. I was walking on a tightrope over a canyon of betrayal. But as we neared the exit doors, the automatic glass sliding open to reveal the gray Chicago sky, I tightened my grip on the phone in my pocket. They were taking me to a nursing home. They were taking me to a prison. But they were forgetting one thing. I was an engineer. And an engineer always inspects the site before he accepts the project. I was not going to Serenity Hills. Not if I had anything to say about it. The game was not over. It was just moving to a new location. The walk from the interrogation room to the exit of the police precinct was only 50 feet. But every step felt like I was walking toward my own execution. My son Brandon had his hand clamped around my upper arm, a grip that was supposed to look supportive to anyone watching, but felt like a shackle to me. Detective Miller stood by the door watching us leave with that same look of misplaced satisfaction, believing he had done a good deed by reuniting a confused father with his loving family. I kept my head down, playing the part of the defeated old man, letting my shoulders slump and my feet shuffle against the linoleum floor. I could feel the eyes of the other officers on me, a mix of pity and indifference, and I knew that once I walked through those double doors, I would disappear from the legal world. I would become a ghost in the system, a name on a file in a locked cabinet, at a facility where the only visitors were guilt and silence. We stopped at the front desk so Brandon could sign the final release forms. He released my arm for a moment to pick up the pen, and in that split second of physical separation, Tiffany moved in. She stepped into the space between me and the exit, blocking my view of the street, like a wall of expensive perfume and malice. She reached out and adjusted the collar of my jacket, her fingers brushing against my neck with a touch that was cold and precise. To the officers behind the desk, it looked like a daughter-in-law fussing over her husband's father, making sure he looked presentable. She leaned in close, her cheek brushing against mine in a mockery of a hug. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," she whispered, and her voice was a razor blade wrapped in silk. "The hearing is in an hour. You are not going to make it. You are never going to make it. The judge will declare you absent, and Brandon will get temporary guardianship by noon." I stiffened, but I did not pull away. I let her think I was paralyzed by fear. "You have a choice, Thomas," she continued. her lips barely moving so no one else could read them. "You can sign the permanent power of attorney over to us right now in the car. If you do that, I will let you go to Serenity Hills. I will even pay for a private room with a view of the garden. You can live out your days watching the birds and pretending you are still important." She paused, letting the offer hang in the air before delivering the alternative. "But if you fight us, if you try to make a scene or call that lawyer of yours again, I will drive you straight to the state psychiatric ward." "Do you know what happens in the public ward, Thomas? They do not have private rooms. They have open bays with screaming patients who smear filth on the walls. They will sedate you until you drool on yourself. You will rot in a bed with bed sores eating into your back, and no one will ever come to visit, because to the world you will be the crazy old man who tried to bring a gun on a plane. You will die alone in the dark, and we will still get the money." She pulled back slightly, looking me in the eyes with a smile that did not reach her gaze. Her eyes were empty, void of any humanity or compassion. It was in that moment that the last remaining fragment of doubt in my mind shattered. I had thought this was about greed. I had thought they just wanted the $5 million in the trust fund to pay off Brandon's gambling debts and fund Tiffany's lavish lifestyle. But as I looked into her soulless eyes, I realized it was much worse than that. She did not just want my money. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to strip away my dignity, my history, and my very existence until I was nothing more than a source of funds. She wanted to murder me without ever pulling a trigger. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying clarity. This was not a family dispute. This was a war for survival. I looked at Brandon, who was finishing the paperwork, his hand shaking slightly as he signed his name. He was weak, a coward, who had let this woman turn him into a monster. But that did not absolve him. He was signing my life away, and he knew it. I needed time. I needed 5 minutes alone without their eyes on me. I needed to access the one weapon they did not know I had. I let my knees buckle slightly, swaying on my feet, as if the weight of the situation was finally too much for my frail body to handle. I let out a low moan, a sound of pathetic resignation. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling with feigned defeat. "Okay, Tiffany. You win. I cannot go to the state ward. Please do not put me there." Tiffany's smile widened, a triumphant curl of her red lips. "I knew you were a smart man," she purred. "I will sign." I stammered, leaning heavily against the counter for support. "I will sign whatever you want. Just promise me the private room. Promise me I will not be alone." "I promise," she lied smoothly, patting my cheek. "Now let's go to the car." I took a step and then stopped, clutching my stomach. "Wait," I said, gasping for air. My stomach. The stress. I think I am going to be sick. I need the bathroom. Please, I cannot hold it. Tiffany's face hardened. "We can stop at a gas station," she hissed, grabbing my arm again. "No," I cried out loud enough for the desk sergeant to look up. "I cannot make it. Please. It is an old man's bladder. Do you want me to soil myself right here?" I saw the flash of disgust in her eyes. The idea of dealing with a soiled old man was more repulsive to her than the idea of sending one to an asylum. She looked at Brandon, who shrugged helplessly. Then she looked at the desk sergeant, who was watching them with a frown. If they denied me a basic human need right here in the police station, it would break the illusion of the loving caregivers they were trying so hard to maintain. "Fine," she snapped, releasing my arm as if it burned her. "You have 2 minutes. Brandon, go with him and stand by the door." I shuffled toward the restroom located just inside the lobby. Brandon followed me, stopping at the entrance as I pushed the heavy door open. "Do not try anything, Dad," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. He thought I was broken. He thought I was going in there to cry or vomit from fear. The door swung shut behind me, and the heavy click of the latch was the most beautiful sound I had heard all morning. The bathroom was empty, smelling of industrial bleach and stale water. The moment I was out of their sight, the tremble in my legs vanished. The fear in my eyes was replaced by the cold calculation of an engineer facing a critical structural failure. I did not go to the toilet. I went straight to the sink, checking the mirror to make sure the door was fully closed. I looked at my reflection. I saw a 70-year-old man with gray hair and tired eyes, but beneath that I saw the man who had calculated the wind shear for the Sears Tower. I was not done yet. I moved quickly. I sat down on the closed lid of the toilet and lifted my right foot. I was wearing my orthopedic dress shoes, the ones with the thick rubber soles that doctors recommended for my arthritis. But these shoes had a modification that no doctor had prescribed. Years ago, after a mugging attempt in Detroit, I had hollowed out a small compartment in the heel of the right shoe. It was a fail-safe, a backup plan for a worst-case scenario I hoped would never happen. My fingers worked fast, prying at the inner lining of the heel. It was tight, but I knew the pressure point. With a sharp tug, the false bottom gave way. There it was, a tiny rectangular chip nestled in the rubber, a nano SIM card. This was not just a phone card. It was a ghost card, unregistered, untraceable, and preloaded with a secure cloud backup of every conversation, every video, and every financial document I had recorded in the last 6 months. It also contained the direct private number of the one person in this city who owed me a favor big enough to bring down a storm. I pulled the SIM card out, my hands steady as rock. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap burner phone I had hidden earlier. I popped the back cover off, removed the battery, and swapped the SIM cards. The phone booted up the screen, glowing with a faint blue light in the dim bathroom. I checked the signal. 4 bars. I stood up, flushing the toilet to create noise cover. I looked at the door. Brandon was standing right on the other side, guarding a prisoner who had just armed himself. Tiffany was waiting in the lobby, checking her watch, counting the seconds until she could claim her victory. They thought they had trapped a mouse, but they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lion. I keyed in a number from memory. It was not my lawyer, Sarah. It was not the police. It was a number I had not called in 20 years. The line rang once, twice. "Yeah," a gruff voice answered. "Frank, it is Tom Harrison," I said, keeping my voice to a whisper. "I am calling in the favor. And bring the van." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I washed my hands, splashing cold water on my face to bring back the look of the frail victim. I stared at myself in the mirror one last time. "Showtime," I whispered. I opened the door and shuffled out, wiping my wet hands on my pants. Brandon was leaning against the wall, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, annoyed. Finally, he grunted. "Let's go, Mom is waiting." I nodded, keeping my head down, hiding the fire in my eyes. I walked back toward the lobby, toward Tiffany, toward the trap they had set. But the dynamic had changed. I was no longer walking to my doom. I was walking them into theirs. The bathroom stall was cramped and smelled of industrial cleaner mixed with the faint metallic tang of old plumbing. But to me it was a command center. My hands, which Tiffany claimed were too shaky to hold a pen, were steady as rock as I held the old Nokia phone. It was a brick of a device, scuffed and scarred from years of use on construction sites, a relic that looked like it belonged in a recycling bin rather than a police station. That was exactly why Detective Miller had ignored it. To him and to the young officers who relied on touchscreens and cloud identification, it was just a piece of junk, a sentimental piece of trash an old man carried around because he could not adapt to the modern world. They saw a paperweight. I saw a lifeline. I slid the back cover on with a satisfying click and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow on my face. It took a moment to boot up the pixelated hourglass, spinning slowly, and for a second my heart hammered against my ribs. If the battery was dead, if the signal was blocked by the thick concrete walls of the precinct, if the software I had coded myself failed to load, then my life was over. I would walk out of here and into a chemically induced oblivion. But then the bars appeared. 1, 2, 3. full signal. The network was alive, and so was I. I did not call a lawyer. I did not call the media. I navigated to a hidden folder in the file system, one that looked like a game of Snake to anyone who did not know the cheat code. I entered the sequence up, down, left, right, and the screen changed. It was no longer a phone interface. It was a remote surveillance feed. They thought I was senile. They thought I was losing my grip on reality, confusing dates and forgetting names. But the truth was, I had never been sharper. The confusion they cited. The stumbling. The memory lapses, those were not symptoms of age. They were symptoms of poisoning. A week ago, I had noticed that the blood pressure medication Brandon brought me every morning had changed. The pills were slightly rounder, a shade of blue that was just a fraction off from the usual teal. Most people would not have noticed. But I spent 40 years staring at blueprints, noticing structural hairline fractures that were invisible to the naked eye. I noticed. I did not take them. I pretended to swallow them and then spat them into the toilet. And the next day, when the fog in my brain started to lift, I realized what was happening. They were drugging me. They were manufacturing the dementia they were now using to imprison me. That afternoon, while they were out at a brunch, I did what any engineer would do when he suspects a structural failure. I installed monitoring equipment. I stood on a chair, my knees aching, and replaced the smoke detector in the living room with a unit I had modified myself. It contained a high-definition pinhole camera with a microphone linked directly to a private server. I had spent the last week waiting, watching gathering data, waiting for the moment the stress test would cause the bridge to snap. And last night, it finally did. I selected the file dated yesterday, 9 p.m. The video took a moment to buffer the little circle spinning on the tiny screen, and I held my breath. Then the image resolved. It was grainy on this old display, but I could see everything. The camera angle looked down on the living room and the open-plan kitchen. I saw Tiffany standing at the granite island, the same island I had paid for when I renovated their kitchen as a wedding gift. She was wearing her silk robe, holding a glass of red wine in one hand. In front of her was my open duffel bag. I pressed the volume button, holding the phone up to my ear, straining to hear over the hum of the bathroom ventilation fan. The audio was crisp. "Make sure you pack enough of the sugar," she said, and her voice, tinny and distorted through the phone speaker, sent a chill down my spine that was colder than the porcelain beneath me. "We need the TSA to hold him for at least 4 hours. If they release him too early, he might still make the flight." I watched as she reached for the canister on the counter. I watched her spoon the white powder into the Ziploc bag. Her movements were precise, calculated. There was no hesitation, no guilt. She was not a desperate woman making a mistake. She was a predator executing a plan. And then I saw Brandon. My son. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. "Are you sure about this, Tiff?" he asked, and I could hear the tremor in his voice. "What if they charge him? What if he goes to federal prison? He is 70 years old." Tiffany laughed. It was a sound I would never forget. A dry, cruel cackle that echoed in the empty bathroom. "Oh, stop being such a baby." "Brandon," she said, taking a sip of wine. "He will not go to prison. He is crazy, remember. We have the medical reports. We have the doctor on payroll. The police will call us, we will cry a little, we will pick him up and drive him straight to Serenity Hills. By the time he realizes what happened, we will have power of attorney, and that trust fund will finally be ours." I watched as she walked over to the toy chest in the corner. I watched her dig out the black plastic gun. I saw her scratch the orange tip off with a steak knife, the scraping sound cutting through the audio feed like a scream. "Happy birthday, old man," she whispered to the empty room, dropping the gun into my bag. "You are going to celebrate it in a cell." I paused the video. My hand was trembling now, but not from fear. It was trembling from a rage so pure, so hot, it felt like molten lead in my veins. I looked at the image frozen on the screen. Tiffany's smirk. Brandon's cowardice, the bag, the gun. It was all there. Every lie, every betrayal, every ounce of the venom they had injected into my life. They had turned my love against me. They had used my trust as a weapon. And they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed that because I was old, I was obsolete. They assumed that because I was a father, I would never strike back. I saved the video to the local memory, and then I engaged the second protocol. I forwarded a copy to the cloud server of my lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, with a timestamp and a priority flag. Even if they smashed this phone now, even if they dragged me away, the truth was out. The data was secure. The structure was sound. I stood up and splashed cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror one last time. The man staring back at me was not the confused victim who had shuffled in here. His eyes were hard. His jaw was set. He was Thomas Harrison, and he was about to bring the house down. I slipped the phone into my pocket, keeping my hand wrapped around it. I unlocked the stall door and stepped out. The bathroom door felt heavy as I pushed it open, but I shoved it with a newfound strength. Brandon was waiting right there, leaning against the wall, checking his Rolex, that damned watch paid for with my stolen dignity. He looked up as I emerged, and for a second, he flinched. Maybe he saw something in my face. Maybe the ghost of the father who had raised him, the man who had taught him right from wrong, flickered in his conscience. But then the greed took over again. "Mom is getting impatient," he grunted, pushing off the wall. "Come on, sign the papers and let's go." I walked past him without a word. I walked straight into the main lobby area where Detective Miller was sitting at his desk typing up the final report of the incident. Tiffany was standing next to him, tapping her manicured nails on the wood, looking bored. When she saw me, she put the mask back on. The concern, the pity, the fake love, it all slid into place like oil over water. "Oh, Dad. There you are," she cooed, reaching out for me. "Do you feel better? Come on, let's get you home." I stopped 5 feet away from Detective Miller's desk. I planted my feet firmly on the ground, the way I would when inspecting a foundation. I did not look at Tiffany. I looked straight at the detective. "Detective Miller," I said, and my voice was no longer the whisper of a dying man. It was the boom of a foreman shouting over the noise of a drill. Miller looked up, surprised by the change in tone. He took off his glasses. "Mr. Harrison, your son is waiting. You are free to go. I am not going anywhere with them," I stated clearly, pointing a finger at Brandon, who had just walked up behind me. "And neither are they." Tiffany let out a nervous laugh. "Oh dear, he is having another episode." Brandon grabbed his arm. "We need to get him to the car before he hurts himself." Brandon reached for me, but I spun around faster than anyone expected. I slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me," I snarled. Detective Miller stood up, his hand instinctively going to his belt. "Mr. Harrison, calm down." "I am calm, Detective," I said, reaching into my pocket. I moved slowly so he would not think I was reaching for a weapon. I pulled out the brick phone. I saw Tiffany's eyes widen. She recognized it. She thought it was dead. She thought it was trash. Before I sign anything, I said, holding the phone up like a shield, "I think there is something you need to see. Something that proves that the only thing crazy about me is that I let these people live in my house for free." I walked up to the desk and placed the phone down. I pressed play. The video started. The tiny screen was small, but the audio was loud and clear in the quiet station. "Make sure you pack enough of the sugar." Tiffany's face went pale. It was not a gradual drain of color, it was instantaneous. She looked like a ghost. Brandon made a choking sound behind me. "He will not go to prison. He is crazy, remember." Detective Miller leaned in. He squinted at the screen. Then he looked at Tiffany, then back at the screen. The boredom left his face, replaced by the sharp, intense focus of a hunter who just realized The prey has walked into the trap. Happy birthday, old man. You are going to celebrate it in a cell. The video ended. Silence filled the room. A heavy, suffocating silence that felt heavier than concrete. I looked at Tiffany. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. There were no more lies to spin. No more tears to fake. The engineer had exposed the cracks, and the whole building was coming down. That, I said, looking Miller in the eye, is the sweetener for your coffee, detective. Now I suggest you arrest the real criminals. The moment my finger hovered over the play button, Tiffany moved. It wasn't the graceful movement of the concerned daughter-in-law she had been playing all morning. It was the desperate lunge of a cornered animal. She threw herself across the short distance between us, her manicured nails aiming straight for the phone in my hand. Her face was twisted in a snarl that stripped away every layer of her carefully constructed beauty. "Give me that!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. But she never reached me. Detective Miller was faster. In one fluid motion, he stepped between us, his arm shooting out to block her path. He didn't push her, but he held his ground like a stone wall, and Tiffany slammed into his forearm with a gasp. "Step back, ma'am," Miller barked, his voice devoid of the earlier sympathy. "Step back right now." Tiffany stumbled backward, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at Brandon, but he was frozen, a statue of cowardice staring at the phone in my hand as if it were a bomb about to detonate. And in a way it was. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I pressed play. The audio wasn't perfect. It had the slight tinny quality of a recording played through a small speaker, but in the dead silence of the police station lobby, it sounded like a thunderclap. Bauken sat la lao ka sungjia. Swatting laudi. The words hung in the air, echoing off the sterile walls. It was Tiffany's voice, unmistakable in its cruelty. It wasn't the sweet, solicitous tone she used with me. It was cold, hard, and calculating. Then Brandon's voice followed, weaker, hesitant, but undeniably compliant. "Are you sure about this, Tiff? What if he goes to prison?" "He won't go to prison. He's crazy, remember? We have the medical reports." I watched the color drain from Brandon's face. It didn't just fade, it vanished, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under heat. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw true fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing money or status, but the primal fear of a man watching his life disintegrate. Tiffany stood paralyzed. Her hands were trembling violently at her sides. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie, but the recording continued. "Happy birthday, old man. You're going to celebrate it in a cell." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It pressed down on us like a physical weight. I looked at Detective Miller. The transformation was terrifying. The tired, overworked bureaucrat was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by a cold, professional fury. Police officers hate many things. They hate violence, they hate disorder, but more than anything, they hate being played. They hate being used as pawns in someone else's game, especially when that game involves wasting their time and resources on a false report. Swatting wasn't a prank to them. It was a crime that put lives at danger. Miller turned slowly to look at Tiffany. His eyes were hard, flinty. His jaw was set so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. So he said, his voice dangerously low, "The gun was a toy. The sugar was sugar. And the call about a suicidal bomber was just a strategy." Tiffany found her voice then. It was shrill, desperate, a high-pitched denial that grated on the ears. "No," she screamed, shaking her head frantically. "No, that's not real. That's not me." She pointed a shaking finger at me, her eyes wild. "He made it up," she yelled. "Look at him. He's an engineer. He's a computer genius. He spends all day on that computer of his. He made that video. It's a deepfake. You hear about them on the news all the time. He used AI to copy my voice. He's trying to frame us because he's paranoid. I told you he was paranoid. She was grasping at straws, flailing in the water as she drowned, but she was fighting with everything she had. She grabbed Brandon's arm, digging her nails into his suit jacket. "Tell him, Brandon," she pleaded, shaking him. "Tell him your father is good with computers. Tell him he's done this before." Brandon looked at her, then at Miller, then at me. He looked like a man waking up from a long dream only to find himself in a nightmare. He stammered, trying to form words, but nothing coherent came out. I... He stuttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Miller didn't look at Brandon. He kept his eyes fixed on Tiffany. "A deepfake," he repeated flatly. "You're telling me this man who you claim has stage 3 dementia and can't remember his own name created a forensic-quality deepfake video of you confessing to a felony inside a secure police station bathroom in under 5 minutes?" "Yes," Tiffany insisted, her eyes bulging. "Yes, he's obsessed. He's capable of anything." Miller stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his radio. "Seal the room." He spoke into the receiver, his voice echoing through the lobby. "Nobody leaves. I want a forensic tech down here now. And get me the lieutenant." The order was like a gavel strike. Officers at the front desk stood up. Uniformed men near the door moved to block the exit. The bustling energy of the station froze, focused entirely on the drama unfolding in the center of the room. But Tiffany wasn't done. Panic had stripped away her reason. She lunged toward me again, not for the phone this time, but for me. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You evil old man," she shrieked, her voice breaking. "You ruined everything. Why couldn't you just die? Why couldn't you just sign the papers and die?" Miller caught her this time, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. He pinned her against the edge of the desk, the sound of her body hitting the wood a dull thud. "That is enough," he roared. "You are under arrest for filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, and attempted assault." Brandon let out a sob, a pathetic sound that made me look away. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was crouching on the floor, his head in his hands. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, feeling a strange calmness wash over me. The storm was raging around me, screaming accusations and the click of handcuffs, but I was the eye of the hurricane. I looked at the phone, the simple old brick that had saved my life. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the truth. And now they were learning the hardest lesson of all. You can build a castle on lies, but you can't live in it when the foundation cracks. The atmosphere in the police station had shifted from a busy administrative hum to the sharp electric tension of a crime scene. Detective Miller stood between me and Tiffany, his hand still resting near his belt, a silent warning that the game had changed. Tiffany was pinned against the desk, her chest heaving as she tried to reconstruct the shattered remains of her narrative. She was a master manipulator, I had to give her that. Even now, with her own voice echoing from the phone as evidence of her guilt, she was looking for an angle, a loophole, a way to twist reality back in her favor. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hair with a trembling hand, and looked Miller in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower, controlled, almost rational. "Officer, please listen to reason," she said, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave. "You are letting a confused old man dictate a police investigation. Do you really think I would be stupid enough to say those things out loud if I knew I was being recorded? This is clearly a setup. He has been planning this. He hates me. He has always hated me because I am not good enough for his precious son. He edited that audio. He took innocent conversations we had about movies or TV shows and spliced them together. You can do that on an iPhone now. Are you going to arrest a mother based on a doctored file from a man diagnosed with paranoia?" Miller hesitated. Just for a second. And that was all she needed. "Look at him," she pressed, her confidence returning. "He is enjoying this. He is smiling. Does that look like a victim to you? Or does it look like someone who just pulled off a sick prank?" I was not smiling, but I was not cowering either. I watched her weave her web trying to snare Miller back into her trap. It was a brilliant defense. In the age of digital manipulation, doubt is the ultimate weapon. If she could make Miller doubt the authenticity of the recording, even for an hour, she could buy enough time to get a lawyer get out on bail and perhaps still force through the guardianship hearing before the forensic team verified the file. I knew I had to end this, not with technology which she could claim was fake, but with something analog, something undeniable, something physical. I took a step forward. The movement drew everyone's eyes. "You make a compelling argument, Tiffany," I said, my voice calm and steady, cutting through her frantic energy. "Technology can be manipulated. Voices can be faked. Maybe I am just a bitter old wizard with a computer." I turned to Detective Miller. "But Detective, there is one thing technology cannot fake. One thing that does not lie." I pointed to the evidence bag sitting on the desk, the one containing the Ziploc bag of powdered sugar and the black plastic gun. "Forensics," I said. Tiffany went still. I looked at her and saw the first true crack in her armor. "You were in a rush last night, Tiffany," I continued, my voice dropping to a conversational tone as if we were discussing the weather. "You were drinking wine. You were laughing. You were so sure of yourself. You were so sure I was asleep." I took another step closer. "Did you wear gloves?" I asked. The color that had been returning to her face drained away instantly, leaving her gray and ashen. "When you spooned that sugar into the bag, when you scraped the orange paint off the tip of that toy gun with a steak knife, did you wear latex gloves, Tiffany? Because if you did not, your fingerprints are all over them. Not on the outside of the bag where you could claim you touched it later. On the inside. On the plastic of the gun. On the handle of the knife you likely threw in your own trash can." I turned back to Miller. "Detective, I am willing to wait for the audio forensics. But I think if you dust that gun right now, you will find her prints all over the trigger mechanism. And I think if you check the bag, you will find her prints on the inside seal. Can a deepfake plant fingerprints, Detective?" Miller looked at the evidence bag. Then he looked at Tiffany. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tiffany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a lie, looking for anything but the truth. But there was nowhere to go. Science does not care about manipulation. Science does not care about tears. Then I looked at Brandon. My son was crouched on the floor, a crumpled heap of expensive fabric and cheap morality. He was looking at Tiffany with a mixture of horror and realization. He knew. He knew she had not worn gloves. He knew she had been sloppy because she was arrogant. And he knew that fingerprints were not a civil matter. They were a criminal one. "Brandon," I said softly. He looked up at me, his eyes wet and terrified. "Fingerprints are hard evidence, son," I said. "That is a felony charge. Planting evidence, filing a false report, conspiracy to commit fraud. That is 5 to 10 years in federal prison." I let the words sink in. 5 to 10 years. Unless I added allowing a sliver of light into his darkness. Unless one of you cooperates. Unless one of you admits that this was not a joint enterprise, that one of you was coerced. It was the final push. The structure was groaning under the weight of the truth, and I just kicked out the last support beam. Brandon looked at Tiffany. He saw the woman who had spent his money, who had isolated him from his father, who had driven him to this precipice. He saw her sinking, and he realized she was going to pull him down with her. He scrambled to his feet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. It was her, he blurted out, his voice high and hysterical. "Brandon!" Tiffany shrieked, spinning around. "Shut up!" "No," Brandon yelled, backing away from her, holding his hands up as if to ward her off. "I am not going to jail for you. I told you it was a bad idea. I told you we shouldn't do it." He turned to Miller, grabbing the detective's sleeve. "Officer, it was her idea. All of it." She put the sugar in the bag. She scraped the gun. She made me call. She said if I didn't help her, she would leave me and take the house. She said Dad was going to cut us off anyway. "You coward," Tiffany screamed, lunging at him, her face a mask of fury. "You spineless little coward." Miller stepped in, separating them, his voice booming over the chaos. "That is enough. Both of you." He looked at Brandon. "Are you stating for the record that you knowingly filed a false police report regarding your father to prevent him from attending a court hearing?" "Yes." Brandon sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "Yes. Just please don't let me go to prison. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted the money." The confession was out. The truth, naked and ugly, lay on the floor of the police station. I looked at my son, and I felt a profound sadness. He had saved himself from prison, perhaps, but he had lost something far more valuable. He had lost his honor. He had lost his father. Tiffany stood alone, isolated by her husband's betrayal. She looked at me, and for a moment the anger vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. She knew it was over. She knew she had lost. And she knew that the old man she had underestimated had just played the final card. Detective Miller reached for his handcuffs again. This time he did not look at me. He walked straight to Tiffany. "Tiffany Harrison, you are under arrest," he said, reciting the words I had waited all morning to hear. I watched as the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. I watched as Brandon wept like a child. And I stood there, the old engineer, surrounded by the rubble of the family I had built, knowing that sometimes you have to let the walls fall so you can see the sky again. The click of the handcuffs around Tiffany's wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard, a metallic snap that signaled the end of her reign of terror. But my moment of victory was short-lived. As the officers led her toward the holding cells, she stopped and turned her head. Her hair was messy, her makeup smeared, but her eyes still held that defiant, venomous glint. She looked at the clock on the wall, then at me, and a twisted smile curled her lips. "You still lose, old man," she spat, her voice dripping with malice. "Look at the time. It is 9:45. Your precious hearing starts in 15 minutes in New York. You are stuck here in Chicago. When the judge calls your name at 10 o'clock and you are not there, he will declare you absent. The trust will be frozen, and eventually Brandon will get it anyway. You might have put me in jail, but you still lost the war." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I looked up at the clock. She was right. 9:45. The hearing was at 10. 15 minutes. I had spent so much energy fighting to prove my innocence, fighting to expose their lies, that I had forgotten the ticking clock. I had won the battle in this police station, but I was about to lose the war in a courtroom 800 miles away. The flight I was supposed to be on was currently descending into LaGuardia. I was grounded, surrounded by police officers with no way to bridge the distance. A wave of despair washed over me, colder and heavier than the fear I had felt earlier. After everything, the fake dementia, the planted drugs, the betrayal, was it all going to be for nothing? Was I going to watch my life's work slip away simply because I couldn't teleport? I slumped against the desk, the adrenaline draining from my body, leaving me feeling every one of my 70 years. Detective Miller was watching me. He saw the shift in my posture, the sudden defeat in my eyes. He looked at the clock, then at the calendar on his desk. He knew what was at stake. He had heard the recording. He knew that if I didn't make that hearing, the justice he had just served would be incomplete. He walked over to me, his heavy boots thudding on the floor. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice urgent, "what exactly is this hearing for? Is it federal or state probate?" I whispered, my throat tight. "State Supreme Court of New York. But it involves a multi-state trust, so it has federal oversight." Miller's eyes lit up. He turned to the lieutenant who had just walked in. "Lieutenant," he barked, "we have a situation. The victim here is a key witness and beneficiary in a high-profile civil case starting in 14 minutes in New York. The suspects used our department to unlawfully detain him and prevent his attendance. If he misses it, these two get exactly what they wanted. We become accomplices to fraud." The lieutenant frowned. "What do you want to do, Miller?" "We can't fly him there." "No," Miller said, grabbing his desk phone. "But this is a federal precinct liaison office. We have a secure video uplink to the judicial network. We use it for arraignments and warrant requests. If we can patch into the New York court system, we can get him into that courtroom virtually." My head snapped up. "Is that possible?" I asked, a flicker of hope sparking in my chest. "Can a judge accept a remote appearance?" "It is up to the judge," Miller said, already dialing a number. "But given the circumstances that you were detained by police due to a false report, I think they will listen." He slammed the phone to his ear. "Get me the court clerk for the New York State Supreme Court Probate Division. Now. This is an emergency police priority." The next 10 minutes were a blur of chaotic efficiency. Miller was shouting orders, officers were running to set up a monitor and a camera in the conference room. I stood in the middle of the whirlwind, feeling like a passenger in a race car driven by a madman. Come on," Miller muttered, pacing back and forth as he waited for the connection. He looked at me. "Do you have the case number?" "Yes," I said, reciting it from memory. "Index number 4592024, Estate of Harrison." Miller relayed the number. He listened, nodded, then cursed. "They are in session. The clerk says the judge is already on the bench. They are going through the docket. You are third on the list." "How much time?" I asked. "Minutes," Miller said. "Maybe less." He grabbed my arm. "Let's go." We ran down the hallway to the conference room. It was a stark room with a long table and a large screen mounted on the wall. A young tech officer was furiously typing on a keyboard. "I am trying to bypass the firewall," the tech said, sweat beading on his forehead. "The New York system is old. It is not shaking hands with our secure line." "Force it," Miller ordered. "Use the emergency warrant channel." I checked my watch. 9:58. In New York, my lawyer Sarah was probably sitting at the table alone, checking her phone, wondering where I was. She would be preparing to ask for a continuance, but without a valid reason, the judge might deny it. And if the opposing counsel, Brandon's lawyer, argued that I was mentally unstable and had wandered off, the judge might rule against me immediately. The screen flickered. Static. Then a blue screen. Then static again. Connecting. The text on the screen blinked. 9:59. I stood in front of the camera, smoothing my jacket, trying to look like the dignified engineer I was, and not a man who had just been interrogated for terrorism. I took a deep breath. "Come on," I whispered. "Build the bridge. Connect the span." Suddenly, the static cleared. The image resolved. It was a courtroom. I saw the wood paneling, the flags, the seal of the state of New York. I saw the back of a lawyer's head, Sarah's blonde hair. And I saw the judge, a stern-looking woman with glasses, looking down at a file. The audio crackled to life. Next on the docket, the clerk's voice rang out, tinny but clear. "The matter of the Harrison Trust. Parties, please step forward." I saw Sarah stand up. She looked nervous. She looked at the empty chair beside her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "My client, Mr. Thomas Harrison, is not present. I have not been able to reach him since this morning. I would like to request a short recess to locate him." I saw the opposing lawyer stand up. He was a slick man in a cheap suit. "Objection." "Your Honor," he said smoothly. "Mr. Harrison is a man of advanced age with a documented history of confusion. His absence today is likely due to his inability to manage his own affairs. We move that the court proceed with the appointment of his son, Brandon Harrison, as temporary guardian." The judge looked over her glasses. If the petitioner is not here, Ms. Jenkins, I have no choice but to entertain the motion. This hearing has been scheduled for months. My heart stopped. This was it. The moment Tiffany had predicted. Detective Miller stepped into the frame beside me. He leaned into the microphone. "Your Honor," he boomed. This is Detective Miller from the Chicago Police Department. We have Mr. Harrison here in protective custody. He is not confused. He is a victim of a crime that prevented his travel, and he is ready to appear." The judge looked up, startled. The whole courtroom turned to look at the large monitor on the wall where my face was now projected. I took a step forward, looking straight into the camera lens. "I am here, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and strong, "and I have quite a story to tell." The screen in front of me flickered with a burst of gray static that looked like snow on a winter night before resolving into the sharp, sterile reality of the New York State Supreme Court. It was a room I knew well from years of litigation regarding land surveys and structural permits, but seeing it now from 1,000 miles away through a digital window felt like looking into an aquarium. The colors were slightly washed out, and the audio had a hollow echo, but the tension in that room was transmitted perfectly across the fiber optic cables. I saw the back of Sarah's head first. She was sitting alone at the heavy oak defense table, her posture rigid, her shoulders slumped in a way that screamed defeat. Beside her was the empty chair meant for me, a void that spoke volumes to everyone in the room. Across the aisle sat Mr. Sterling, the attorney my son Brandon had hired, with money he likely borrowed against the very inheritance he was trying to steal. Sterling was standing up, buttoning his jacket, with the confident air of a man who knows the game is over and he is holding the winning ticket. He was shaking his head slowly, performing a pantomime of deep regret for the benefit of the judge. "Your Honor," Sterling said, and his voice came through the speakers in the Chicago conference room with a tinny sharpness. "It brings me no pleasure to say this. We have waited 30 minutes past the docket time. Mr. Harrison is not here. His counsel cannot locate him. This unfortunately confirms exactly what the family has been fearing for months." He paused for effect, looking toward the gallery, where I assumed he expected to see a sympathetic audience, though the seats were likely empty. "Mr. Harrison has wandered off." Sterling continued, his tone dripping with false concern. "He is a man of advanced age, facing severe cognitive decline. His son Brandon is frantic with worry right now, likely searching the streets of Chicago for his confused father. We cannot let the estate remain in limbo while Mr. Harrison is out there vulnerable and incapable of making rational decisions. We move for an immediate emergency ruling to grant temporary guardianship to Brandon Harrison, effective immediately, so we can secure the assets for Mr. Harrison's own protection." I watched the judge. Judge Reynolds. She was a stern woman known for her impatience with delays. She looked at the clock on the wall behind her. It was 9:59. She looked at Sarah, who was frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to text me one last time. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said, and her voice was tired. "Do you have any objection that is based on fact and not hope? Do you have a location for your client?" Sarah stood up slowly. She looked small against the grandeur of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I spoke to him this morning. He was lucid. He was at the airport. Something must have happened. I am asking for 24 hours. Just 24 hours. "We do not have 24 hours, Sterling interrupted, slamming his hand softly on the table. "Every hour the assets are frozen is an hour the estate loses value. This is a clear case of incapacity. The man is missing, Your Honor." Judge Reynolds sighed. She reached for her gavel. I saw her hand wrap around the wooden handle. I saw her lift it. That piece of wood was about to come down and smash my life into pieces. It was about to validate every lie Tiffany and Brandon had spun. It was about to erase Thomas Harrison, the engineer, and replace him with Thomas Harrison, the invalid. I did not wait for the connection to stabilize fully. I did not wait for Detective Miller to give me the signal. I stepped forward until my face was filling the camera frame, until I could see my own reflection in the lens. "I object, Your Honor," I said. My voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, loud and distorted by the sudden volume, but undeniable. The effect was instantaneous. Judge Reynolds froze her gavel, hovering in midair. Sarah spun around so fast she almost knocked over her chair. Mr. Sterling looked up at the ceiling as if the voice of God had just interrupted his closing argument. The large screen mounted on the wall behind the judge's bench, which had been black a moment ago, suddenly flared to life. The static cleared, and the image of the Chicago police conference room flooded the New York court. I saw their faces change. They were expecting to see a hospital bed. They were expecting to see a confused old man calling from a park bench or a nursing home. Instead, they saw me. I was standing straight, my tie knotted perfectly, my eyes clear and focused. And behind me, prominent and unmistakable, was the blue and gold seal of the Chicago Police Department and the American flag standing in the corner. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Reynolds asked, squinting at the screen. "Where are you? You are interrupting my court." "I am not missing, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of the last 3 hours of hell. "And I am certainly not confused. I am currently standing in the Federal Liaison Office of the Chicago Police Department, Precinct 12. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I saw Sterling's confidence falter. He squinted at the screen, trying to process the visual information. He saw the police seal. He saw the harsh fluorescent lighting. This did not fit his narrative of a wandering, senile man. Police Judge Reynolds repeated, putting her gavel down. "Are you under arrest, Mr. Harrison?" "No, Your Honor," I replied. "I am in protective custody. I was detained this morning at O'Hare Airport, preventing me from boarding my flight. I was detained because of a malicious tip called in regarding a bomb threat and narcotics possession." Sterling jumped up. "Objection. Your Honor, this is irrelevant hearsay. We do not know who called," I cut him off. I did not raise my voice, but I projected it with the force of a pile driver. "The call was made by my son, Brandon Harrison," I stated, "and the narcotics were powdered sugar packed by my daughter-in-law." Silence descended on the courtroom. Absolute heavy silence. Sterling looked like he had been slapped. Sarah had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and relief. I continued before anyone could interrupt. I was held for 3 hours. I was interrogated. I was nearly committed to a psychiatric ward based on forged medical documents faxed by the very people asking you for guardianship right now. But I am here. I am sane, and I am not alone. I stepped to the side. Detective Miller walked into the frame. He looked every inch the seasoned law enforcement officer. He was not smiling. He looked angry. He looked like justice personified. He adjusted his badge on his belt and looked straight into the camera lens, addressing the judge across the country. "State your name and rank," the judge ordered, sitting up straighter. "Detective Frank Miller, Chicago Police Department," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "Your Honor, I am the lead investigator on the incident involving Mr. Harrison this morning." Sterling tried one last desperate move. "Your Honor, we have no way to verify who this man is." "This could be Counselor. Sit down," Judge Reynolds snapped. Her patience was gone. "Go ahead, Detective Miller. What is the status of Mr. Harrison?" Detective Miller took a breath. "Your Honor, Mr. Harrison is currently a material witness and a victim in an active felony investigation regarding filing a false police report, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted assault on a police officer. We have 2 suspects in custody currently being processed in the holding cells downstairs." "2 suspects?" Judge Reynolds asked, though I think she already knew the answer. "Yes, Your Honor," Miller said. "Brandon Harrison and Tiffany Harrison. They were arrested 10 minutes ago after confessing to planting evidence and orchestrating a swatting incident to prevent the defendant from appearing in your courtroom. We have video and audio evidence of the conspiracy recorded by Mr. Harrison himself." I watched Sterling. He collapsed into his chair. He knew it was over. He was not just losing a case, he was realizing his clients were not going to pay his bill because they were going to be trading their designer clothes for prison jumpsuits. Detective Miller continued. Mr. Harrison is fully cogent. He has been cooperative and instrumental in the investigation. The only reason he is not in your courtroom physically is because we needed him here to identify the perpetrators. He is not incapacitated, Your Honor. He is the sharpest witness I have interviewed in 20 years. I stepped back into the frame standing next to Miller. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, I said, I apologize for the delay, but I believe I have proven that I am quite capable of managing my own affairs, and I would like to make a motion regarding the trust. Judge Reynolds looked at me. A small smile touched her lips, the first I had ever seen. I am listening. Mr. Harrison, she said, the floor is yours. The silence that followed my introduction was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a sudden and violent shift in reality. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer who had been so articulate just moments ago, stood with his mouth slightly open, his hand hovering over his expensive leather briefcase. He looked at the screen, then at the judge, then back at the screen as if trying to rearrange the pixels into a picture that made sense to his strategy. But there was no strategy that could account for this. The murmurs in the gallery behind him grew louder, a rising tide of whispers and gasps, as the spectators realized they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a standard probate hearing. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her glasses sliding down her nose. She looked from me to the stunned lawyer in her courtroom. Mr. Sterling, she said, and her voice was ice cold. It appears your client is not searching the streets for his lost father. It appears your client is currently in police custody. Do you have an explanation for this? Sterling stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Your Honor, I was not informed. I have been unable to reach Mr. Brandon Harrison this morning. You assumed wrong, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his stuttering. You assumed I was feeble. You assumed I was broken. And you assumed that because I was old, I would simply fade away and let you dismantle my life's work. I looked straight into the camera lens, addressing the judge directly. Your Honor, words are easy to manufacture. My son and his wife manufactured a medical history. They manufactured a crime. And they nearly manufactured my disappearance. But I am an engineer, and in my profession we do not rely on words. We rely on visual evidence. I turned to the young tech officer sitting at the console. Son, turn the camera around. The officer looked at Detective Miller, who gave a sharp nod. The officer picked up the webcam from the top of the monitor. The image on the screen in New York swiveled, blurring for a second, before snapping back into focus. The gasp from the New York courtroom was audible even over the speaker. The camera was now pointed at the back of the conference room. There, handcuffed to two metal chairs, sat Brandon and Tiffany. They were no longer the confident puppet masters. They looked small, crumpled, and utterly defeated. Brandon had his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Tiffany was staring blankly at the floor, her makeup smeared a ghost of the woman who had smirked at me earlier. Two uniformed officers stood guard behind them, their arms crossed. This, Your Honor, I said, stepping back into the frame so the judge could see me standing next to the image of my arrested family. This is the reality of the situation. My son is not worried about my health. He is worried about his prison sentence. The woman next to him is not a grieving daughter-in-law. She is the architect of a conspiracy to defraud this court and strip me of my civil rights. I watched Sterling collapse into his chair. He put his head in his hands. He knew his career was taking a hit that might never heal. To unknowingly present a fraudulent petition is one thing, but to be the face of a coup that involved a felony arrest was a disaster. Judge Reynolds stared at the screen for a long time. When she spoke, her voice trembled with suppressed rage. I have sat on this bench for 20 years, Mr. Harrison. I have seen greed, I have seen betrayal, but I have never seen a darker display of ungratefulness than what I am looking at right now. She turned her gaze back to me. Mr. Harrison, the court apologizes to you. The system was weaponized against you, and we nearly failed you. I nodded, accepting the apology, but there was no joy in it. Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was breaking. I do not need an apology. I need a resolution. I spent 40 years building the assets in this trust. I built them to protect my family. I thought I was building a foundation for my son to stand on, but I see now that I was only building a cushion for him to fall on, so he never had to learn how to stand up himself. I took a deep breath. I am not mad, Your Honor. I am not suffering from dementia or delusions. I am suffering from the clarity of a man who has finally opened his eyes. I have lost my faith in my bloodline, but I have not lost my mind. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I moved to revoke the current will and testament effective immediately. I moved to strip Brandon Harrison and Tiffany Harrison of any and all beneficiary status in the Harrison Family Trust. And I ask the court to apply the doctrine of unworthiness. They have sought to destroy the testator, therefore they have forfeited their right to the inheritance. Judge Reynolds did not hesitate. She did not ask for a counter-argument from Sterling, because there was none to be made. She picked up her gavel, and this time the wood felt like a weapon of righteousness. The court accepts the evidence provided by the Chicago Police Department, she declared, her voice booming. Based on the visual confirmation of the arrest and the testimony of Mr. Thomas Harrison, the motion for emergency guardianship is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, this court invokes the unworthiness doctrine under New York probate law. Brandon Harrison and Tiffany Harrison are hereby deemed unfit to inherit any portion of the estate due to their egregious conduct and criminal intent against the decedent's rights. She brought the gavel down. Bang! The sound was sharp and final. It echoed through the speakers in Chicago, and I saw Brandon flinch as if he had been physically struck. Tiffany closed her eyes, a single tear of self-pity rolling down her cheek. The judge continued writing furiously on her docket. Mr. Harrison, you have full control of your assets. I am also issuing a temporary restraining order, barring both individuals from coming within 500 feet of you or your property, pending their criminal trial. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. Ms. Jenkins, the judge said, addressing my lawyer, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Please assist your client in restructuring the trust as he sees fit. And Mr. Sterling. Yes. Your Honor, Sterling squeaked, standing up. You will report this incident to the Bar Association immediately. If I find out you had any prior knowledge of this scheme, you will be joining your clients in a cell. No. Your Honor, I swear I didn't know, Sterling cried out. Judge Reynolds looked at me one last time through the screen. Her expression softened. Mr. Harrison, go home. You have had a long day. The screen went black. The connection was cut. The courtroom vanished, leaving me back in the fluorescent reality of the police station. I looked at the black monitor, and then I turned around to face my son. The room was quiet. Detective Miller signaled to the officers. Take them down to booking. As the officers pulled Brandon to his feet, he looked at me. His face was a ruin of tears and snot. Dad, he whispered. Dad, please. I have nothing. If you cut me off, I have nothing. I looked at him and I felt a phantom pain in my chest, the echo of the love I had carried for him since he was a baby. But I also remembered the coldness of the interrogation room. I remembered the medical report that called me insane. You are wrong, Brandon, I said, my voice soft but firm. You have your health. You have your youth. And for the first time in your life, you have the opportunity to earn something with your own hands. That is not nothing. That is a gift. Do not waste it. I watched them lead him out. He stumbled, his legs weak, his head hanging low. Tiffany did not look at me. She stared straight ahead, her face set in a mask of bitter hatred. She would never learn. She would never understand. But that was no longer my problem to solve. Detective Miller walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Tom. You did good." I nodded, feeling the exhaustion finally wash over me. I had won. The fortune was safe. My freedom was secure. But as I stood there in the quiet aftermath of the storm, I realized that the price of this victory was the family tree itself. I had pruned the rot, but I was the only branch left standing. The video link cut out, leaving the conference room in a sudden, stark silence that felt louder than the courtroom had been. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me, a face that looked tired, but for the first time in years, unburdened. The adrenaline that had carried me through the interrogation, the bathroom subterfuge, and the high-stakes hearing was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a dull ache in my joints, but a sharp clarity in my mind. I turned away from the monitor and looked back into the main holding area, where the reality of what I had just done was playing out in high definition. The police station was no longer a place of confusion for me. It was now a processing plant for justice. I watched as two officers escorted Tiffany and Brandon toward the booking desk. The transformation in them was complete and terrifying to behold. Gone were the polished, concerned relatives who had walked in here to commit me to an asylum. In their place were two criminals stripping away their masks because there was no one left to fool. Tiffany was fighting. Not physically, she was too smart to assault an officer again, but she was fighting with her words, launching a venomous triad that echoed off the cinder block walls. She twisted in the grip of the female officer holding her, her face contorted into a snarl that made her look decades older than she was. "You miserable old wretch," she screamed, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her rage. "You planned this. You sat in my house eating my food and planning this the whole time. You think you have won. You have won nothing. You are going to die alone, Thomas. No one will be at your funeral. No one will mourn you. You are a bitter, selfish old man who cares more about his money than his own family." I stood there leaning against the doorframe of the conference room and listened. Her words were meant to wound, meant to find the soft spots of a grandfather's heart and tear them open. But they bounced off me like pebbles against steel. I looked at her, and I didn't see a daughter-in-law. I didn't see the woman I had welcomed into my home 10 years ago. I saw a parasite that had finally been detached. Her anger wasn't righteous indignation. It was the panic of a predator that had just realized it was no longer at the top of the food chain. Brandon was a different story. He wasn't screaming. He was disintegrating. He stumbled as they led him toward the fingerprint scanner, his legs barely supporting his weight. He looked back at me over his shoulder, his eyes red and swollen, filled with a terrified, pleading child, like desperation that tugged at a memory of him falling off his bike when he was 6. "Dad." He sobbed the word wet and heavy. "Dad, please. Don't let them do this. I'm your son. I'm sorry. I swear I'm sorry. She made me do it. I'll change, Dad. I'll get a job. I'll pay you back every cent. Just tell them to stop. You can stop this. You can tell them it was a mistake. Please, Dad, don't put me in a cage." For a split second, my hand twitched. The instinct to protect him was hardwired into my DNA, woven into the fiber of my being, over 40 years of fatherhood. I remembered teaching him to tie his shoes. I remembered driving him to college. I remembered the pride I felt when he got his first job, even though he quit it 3 months later. The urge to intervene, to talk to Miller, to say that they had learned their lesson and we could handle this privately, was a physical pull in my chest. But then I looked at his wrist. The handcuffs had replaced the Rolex, but the ghost of that watch was still there. I remembered the conversation in the video, the casual way they had discussed my imprisonment, the way he had agreed to drug me to steal my agency. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. He wasn't crying because he hurt me. He was crying because he was about to face consequences for the first time in his life without me there to write a check and make them go away. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of stale coffee and floor wax. In my mind, I wasn't in a police station. I was back on a job site, standing in front of a condemned building. It was a structure I had once loved, a house with good bones and potential. But the foundation was rotten. Termites of greed and entitlement had eaten through the support beams. Mold of deceit had blackened the walls. A younger architect might try to patch the cracks, paint over the mold, and hope it held. But I was a structural engineer. I knew the laws of physics, and I knew the laws of character. If the foundation is compromised, the building will fall. And if you try to save it, it will only collapse on top of you. There is no repair for a rotted soul. The only safe option is demolition. I opened my eyes, and the sentimentality was gone. I felt light. Not happy, but light. The heavy, crushing weight of suspicion and gaslighting that had pressed on me for months had lifted. Detective Miller walked over to me holding a clipboard. He looked from me to the booking desk where Brandon was now wailing, and Tiffany was being warned to remain silent or face a gag. Miller's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were kind. "Mr. Harrison," Miller said, his voice low, "we have the statements. We have the video evidence. The district attorney is already on the line. But before we finalize the booking, there is one formality." He handed me the clipboard and a pen. "Because this involves family, and because the initial report was domestic in nature, you have a right to decline prosecution on the personal assault charges. You can sign a waiver of non-prosecution. The state will still pursue the false police report charge, but without your cooperation on the fraud and attempted harm charges, the case will be significantly weaker. They might get probation. They might walk away with a slap on the wrist." He tapped the top box on the form. Or Miller continued tapping the bottom box. "You can sign the formal criminal complaint confirming that you wish to press charges to the fullest extent of the law for conspiracy, fraud, and domestic abuse." I looked at the form. The paper was white and crisp, the legal jargon dense and black. It was just a piece of paper, but it was the heaviest thing I had ever held. I looked over at Brandon. He had stopped crying for a moment, watching me, watching the pen in my hand. He held his breath. He thought he saw hesitation. He thought he saw the father who always forgave the father who always fixed it. He offered me a weak, tremulous smile, a sliver of hope that the old dynamic was still in play. I looked at him and I didn't smile back. "I am not doing this to hurt you, son," I thought, the words ringing clearly in my head, though my lips didn't move. "I am doing this because I love you enough to finally let you grow up. I failed you by shielding you from the rain, so you never learned to build a roof. Now you are going to learn." I lowered the pen. I did not check the waiver box. I moved my hand down to the section marked Victim's Affirmation of Prosecution. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper hard enough to dent the fibers. I signed my name, Thomas Edward Harrison, with a flourish, my signature strong and unwavering. It was the signature of a man who was done being a victim. I handed the clipboard back to Miller. "Do it," I said, my voice flat. Miller nodded, taking the clipboard. He understood. He walked over to the booking sergeant and handed him the paperwork. The sergeant nodded and slammed a stamp down on the file. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Brandon screamed. It was a sound of pure betrayal, a shriek of disbelief. "No, Dad, no!" "You can't." Tiffany stopped cursing and went deadly silent, staring at me with a look of genuine shock. She hadn't believed I had it in me. She had bet her life on my weakness, and she had lost everything. "Take them back," the sergeant ordered. 2 officers grabbed Brandon by the arms, hauling him up. He went limp, his legs dragging on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, calling my name over and over again. "Dad, Dad." Tiffany walked upright, her head high, but her eyes were dead. She looked at me one last time as she passed, and for a fleeting second I saw fear. Real, naked fear. I watched them go. They were led down the long hallway, toward the heavy steel door that separated the precinct from the holding cells. The hallway was gray and narrow, a tunnel into a future they had carved for themselves. I didn't turn away. I forced myself to watch. I owed it to myself to see it through. They reached the door. The officer swiped a key card and the heavy lock buzzed. The door swung open, revealing the stark concrete interior of the cell block. Brandon tried to twist around to look at me one last time, but the officer shoved him forward. "Dad," was his final cry, echoing off the metal surfaces, and then the door swung shut. Clang. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. It was a final, definitive sound. The sound of a chapter ending. The sound of a book closing. I stood there in the silence that followed, staring at the gray metal door. I waited for the grief to hit me. I waited for the regret. But it didn't come. Instead, I took a deep breath, and my lungs filled with air that tasted sweet and clean. I checked my watch. It was 10:30. The sun was shining outside. I was 70 years old. I had no wife. I had no children I could call my own anymore. I was alone. But as I turned my back on that steel door and walked toward the exit of the police station, I realized something profound. Being alone was not the same as being lonely. And for the first time in a long time, I was in excellent company. I was with a man I respected. I was with myself. I stepped out of the precinct, and the automatic doors slid shut behind me with a finality that felt like a seal breaking. The air outside was different. Inside it had been stale, recycled air, heavy with the scent of desperation and lies. Outside, the midday sun was high and bright. It was noon in Chicago, and the light reflected off the pavement with a brilliance that made me squint. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the exhaust fumes and the cold lake wind, and to me it smelled like oxygen. It smelled like a second chance. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just letting the warmth of the sun soak into my suit jacket. Passers-by walked around me, talking on their phones, rushing to lunch meetings, completely unaware that the old man standing still in the middle of the flow had just dismantled his entire life and was preparing to build a new one. I checked my pockets. I had my wallet. I had my passport, which the police had returned to me. And I had the old brick phone. I looked at it one last time before dropping it into a trash can near the curb. I did not need it anymore. The surveillance was over. The evidence was filed. I was done looking backward. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out my smartphone, which I had turned off hours ago. I powered it on. Messages flooded in. Missed calls from Brandon. Missed calls from Tiffany. Texts from their lawyer. I deleted them all without reading a single word. Then I dialed the only number that mattered. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Thomas," she breathed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Are you all right? The judge is still on the bench, but she has signed the order. You are safe there. The assets are frozen. I am fine, Sarah," I said, and my voice sounded stronger than it had in years. "I am better than fine. But we have work to do." I walked toward the taxi stand as I spoke, my stride long and purposeful. "I want you to draft a new trust," I said. "I want it ready for my signature by the time I land." "Where are you going?" she asked. I ignored the question and continued. "First, I want you to liquidate 20% of the portfolio. Take that money and establish the Harrison Scholarship Fund. It is for students in structural engineering. But not just any students, Sarah. I want you to find the kids who are working night shifts to pay tuition. The kids who have dirt under their fingernails. The ones who know the value of $1 because they had to bleed to earn it. I want to pay for their education in full." There was a silence on the other end. "That is a wonderful legacy, Thomas," she said softly. I am not done, I continued. There is the matter of my granddaughter Lily. She is innocent in this. She is just a child living in a house built on greed. I do not want her to pay for the sins of her parents. I stopped at the curb, raising my hand to hail a cab. Set up a separate trust for her. Put enough in it to cover her education and her first home. But Sarah listened to me closely. This is non-negotiable. The trust is to be locked in a blind account. Brandon and Tiffany are not to know it exists. They cannot access the principal. They cannot access the interest. Not a single penny goes to them for administrative fees or housing allowances. Lily gets full control when she turns 25. If she needs money before then for school, the checks go directly to the university, not to her parents. I understand, Sarah said, her voice professional but warm. I will make it ironclad. They will not be able to touch it with a laser cutter. Good, I said. And Sarah, thank you. You were the only one who listened when the world thought I was crazy. Send the bill to my personal account. And add a bonus. You earned it. I hung up just as a yellow cab pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window. He looked tired, a man working a long shift just trying to get by. Where to, pal? He asked. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The vinyl seat was cracked and the car smelled of pine air freshener. It was a far cry from the luxury sedans Brandon insisted on hiring, but it felt more comfortable to me. I looked at the partition. I looked at the city skyline reflecting in the window. I had a ticket to New York in my pocket. The hearing was over. The business was done. There was nothing for me in New York anymore. There was nothing for me in Chicago either. The big house in the suburbs was empty now. It was just a pile of bricks and mortar haunted by the ghosts of the family I thought I had. I didn't want to go back there. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I thought about my wife, Martha. I thought about the travel brochures she used to keep on her nightstand. Glossy pictures of blue water and green mountains. We had always promised each other we would go. We would take a month, she said. We would drink coffee on a balcony and watch the sun rise over the Pacific. But then life happened. Work happened. Brandon happened. And then the cancer happened. We never went. I had spent the last 5 years mourning her by sitting in the dark, preserving her memory in a museum of dust. But today I had learned that preservation is not life. Life is movement. Life is building. I leaned forward. O'Hare Airport, I said. International Terminal. You got a flight? The driver asked, pulling into traffic. Not yet, I said, smiling for the first time that day. But there is a flight to Maui leaving in 3 hours. I intend to be on it. The driver laughed. Maui, huh? Sounds nice. One way or round trip. I looked out the window as the city sped by. The skyscrapers of Chicago stood tall and proud monuments to engineering and resilience. They survived storms. They survived winters. They stood because their foundations were deep and true. One way, I said, for now. As the taxi merged onto the highway, I sat back and closed my eyes. I thought about Brandon sitting in that cell. I felt a pang of phantom pain deep in my chest. It was the ache of a father who had to cut off his own limb to save the body. I had lost 2 children today. There was no sugarcoating that. The grief would come later, I knew. It would come in the quiet moments at night. It would come on birthdays and holidays. But as the skyline receded behind me, I also felt something else. I felt the weight lifting. I had spent so years being the provider, the protector, the wallet, the safety net. I had allowed myself to be diminished, to be treated as a resource rather than a person. I had enabled their greed with my silence. I opened my eyes and looked at the horizon. Money cannot buy you loyalty. I had learned that the hard way. It cannot buy you love, and it certainly cannot buy you respect. But dignity, Dignity is something you cannot buy either. You have to build it. You have to defend it. And sometimes you have to burn down everything else to keep it. I found myself again today. Thomas Harrison was not a victim. He was not a senile old man. He was a survivor. When the taxi pulled up to Terminal 5, a strange sensation washed over me. It was the same curb, the same sliding glass doors, the same bustling noise of travelers that had surrounded me this morning. But everything looked different. 6 hours ago, I stood here in handcuffs, humiliated with the weight of my son's betrayal crushing my spine. Now I walked through those doors with my head held high, carrying a bag that I had packed myself free of their lies and their sugar. I walked up to the ticket counter. "1 ticket to Maui, please," I told the agent. "First class, one way." She smiled, a genuine warmth that felt foreign after the coldness of the interrogation room. "That sounds like a dream trip, sir. Celebrating something." I looked at my reflection in the glass partition. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a clueless old man. I saw Thomas Harrison, a man who had walked through fire and come out made of steel. "Yes," I replied, handing her my credit card, the one only I controlled. "I am celebrating a retirement, not from my career but from a lifetime of putting everyone else before myself." Passing through security was the final test. I placed my shoes and belt on the conveyor belt. I watched my bag go through the scanner. I held my breath for a split second, a phantom echo of the morning's trauma. But the belt kept moving. The agent nodded. "You're clear, sir." I walked to the gate, and for the first time in months, the knot in my stomach uncoiled. I sat by the window and watched the planes take off, huge metal birds defying gravity. I realized that I was just like them. I had been grounded by heavy burdens that weren't mine to carry. But now the baggage was gone. As I boarded the plane and settled into the wide leather seat, a flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne. I took it. I looked out the window as Chicago began to shrink beneath us, turning into a grid of lights and concrete. Somewhere down there in a cold cell, Brandon and Tiffany were facing their new reality. I didn't wish them harm, but I didn't wish them well either. I simply released them. I raised the glass to the clouds. "To you, Martha," I whispered, "and to the man I am finally allowing myself to be. If you are listening to this story and you see yourself in the reflection of my words, pay attention. If you are holding on to a relationship solely because of biology, stop. If you are tolerating disrespect because you are afraid of being alone, stop. Look at the foundation of your house. If the wood is rotten, if the ground is shifting, do not try to patch it with money or silence. Let it fall. It will be painful. It will be loud. The dust will choke you for a while. But when the dust settles, you will be standing in the sunlight. And you will realize that the view from the rubble is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen, because it is the view of freedom." This is Thomas Harrison signing off. I have a plane to catch. And after that, I have a life to live.